The greatness of America is not in its Constitution. It's not in its large amount of natural resources. It's not in its political system. It's in the righteousness of its people.
The line between good and evil doesn't run between these different groups or nationalities or, what have you. It runs through every human heart. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Dive Deeper. I'm Andrea Woodmancy, and I am so excited that you joined us today. We have a special guest in studio. This is my friend Dustin Romney. He is an attorney extraordinaire and author of the book, Rule of Law, Why We Should Amend the Constitution. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Why and How We Should Amend the Constitution. That's the subtitle.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually published about 10 years ago. I saw, like most conservatives see, the big debt bomb that we're seeing right now, and you can clearly see, as we're seeing now, the political impossibility of trying to get spending cuts. And there are mechanisms put in place in the Constitution to allow for amendments that can go through the states without having to involve Congress at all. So my view is that that is probably a more viable mechanism to try to see if we can't get more restraints placed on the government or restored from the government. A lot of conservatives will get a little nervous when we start toying around with the Constitution because they think it's sacrosanct, which it is. It's a sacred document. But it itself provides for ways to amend it if things are getting out of control, and I think we all agree that things are out of control, and I think constitutional amendments are one of the ways we can restore some order to Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And I think one of those sacrosanct principles from the Constitution would be right there in the First Amendment with Congress shall enact no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor abridge
the freedom of speech.
Right. So we have the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech right there up front in the First Amendment. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, especially as it relates to some of the issues in the Book of Mormon and some of our modern day issues. So let's start off. We were talking about Korihor.
Yes.
And his story raises some interesting thoughts for us, especially as members of the church, how we deal with debate, how we deal with our critics perhaps, and how we really uphold free speech. So let's talk about Korihor a little bit. What was he teaching? What was the problem with Korihor?
Yeah, Korihor is, I think, a really great story for us because to me, more than any other story in the Book of Mormon, it is so obviously applicable to our day. It's almost crystal clear why Mormon decided to include this story, because he could see our day and he could see what was going on and he could see the same arguments that were going to be made against religion and against the religious authorities. And those are the same types of messages that Korihor was bringing in his day. And of course, we find out at the end of the story that Korihor admits that Satan taught him exactly what to say.
Right.
And his messages were that religion is trying to hold people down, trying to glut off of their labors, and is caught up in the foolish traditions of their fathers.
Right.
All of those messages of which we're clearly hearing today.
Right. It's very familiar messages today. And I think he then goes further and teaches a new type of gospel, sort of a replacement gospel, and it's one of relativism, where it doesn't matter what someone does as long as, it's the fruit of your labor. And so
every man fares according to his own genius.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think those are really prevalent messages in our world today, teaching that you don't need religion, you just need yourself.
It's interesting that he's described as Antichrist, which we usually, if we look at Book of Revelations where it talks about Antichrist, we think of this really scary demon-like
like an
figure
end days monster,
that's going to come down with fire and brimstone. This is just a guy that's out there teaching his belief. He's preaching atheism, and he's preaching that there is no Christ and there's no prophecy. That's Antichrist, and we see it very prevalently all around us.
So how did the Nephites react to his message?
Well, they arrested him. So that's where this freedom of speech that we talked about at the beginning of the conversation and how it plays into the story. It's interesting, and it's to me quite a conundrum philosophically to deal with. As you know, as an attorney, I think analytically, and I approach these problems and I try to break things out and see how we deal with this and parse this out. And you can tell it's an issue that sort of presents an internal contradiction, because Mormon starts out abridging this story in verse 7 by saying, now there was no law against a man's belief, for it was strictly contrary to the commands of God that there should be a law which should bring men onto unequal grounds. And sidebar, maybe we can get into this later, the unequal part I think is really interesting, because there's a lot of talk in here about equality, which we think more of as a modern sort of political invention, but it goes back a long ways.
If you guys want to spend some time with us and Andrea Woodmansey, come with us on the 2026 Podcaster Wavemaker Cruise with Go and Do Travel, November 16th through the 21st.
Those of you that joined us this last year, we had an amazing time. Each of the presenters that are coming are going to be giving presentations every single day. Guys like Greg Madsen, like Hayden said, Andrea Woodmansey, Cardinellis, Jacob Hansen.
Jonah Barnes is going to be there.
Jonah Barnes is going to be there. It's going to be a fun
and others
crew
as well. Awesome people.
Yeah, so if you're interested in that, link in the description. You can find all the information on how to reserve your spot.
And don't forget to use code TheStickOfJoseph in order to get a discount. Now back to the video.
But that's how Mormon introduces this story, and then we end up seeing later on that he goes to the people of Gideon, and they take him and they bind him and they bring him in front of the civil and religious authorities to be questioned. So they arrested him.
Right.
And the same thing happened when he went to the people of Jershon. And according to our political sensibilities today, we would be aghast at somebody being, even an atheist, even an antichrist.
Being arrested simply because of something they believe.
Imagine an atheist college professor being arrested for teaching atheism in a philosophy class or something. We would be aghast at that, and I think rightfully so. But I think, to be fair to the Nephites, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, they're a little young in their experiment with democracy and freedom. This is in the 17th year of the reign of the judges. Their founding father, Mosiah, had established that system for them. Previous to that, you have centuries of rule by kings going all the way back to the Old Testament, and that tradition that was brought over with Lehi and Nephi and their family. So this is a new thing for them to deal with democracy and freedom, and how do we work with this? I think they're used to a lot more strict commands, especially under a law of Moses type of structure, where it's, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, and you follow the letter of the law. And so here's this person coming in, interrupting our rejoicings and teaching against our beliefs. And so
But he's also having some success.
He is having some success among the Nephites.
Right.
But he goes to the people of Ammon in the land of Jershon and doesn't have as much success. And Mormon describes them as being more wise, right, for arresting him than the Nephites were. Because apparently the Nephites were kind of letting him do his thing, at least for the most part. And some of them were believing his words and getting caught up in those flattering words. But then he goes to, now this man went over, and I'm reading in verse 19, now this man went over to the land of Jershon also to preach these things among the people of Ammon, who were once the people of the Lamanites. But behold, they were more wise than the many of the Nephites, for they took him and bound him and carried him before Ammon, who was the high priest over that people.
Right. So they're basically bringing him in to the religious authorities.
In that instance, yes. And then I think Ammon kind of dismisses him, and we don't have any record of what Ammon did or did not do, but apparently Ammon released him, and that's part of...
He was free to go at that point.
Yeah, I mean, and maybe Ammon understood politically, obviously pure speculation, but we've talked about how we wish we had so much more of these stories. Mormon had to abridge so much. But it is interesting that Ammon just kind of seems to let him go, and we don't have any record of what that exchange was. It's possible that Ammon could have said, this is contrary to our laws, I don't think we should be arresting this guy. So they let him go. And then he goes over into Gideon, and the people in Gideon arrest him.
Right.
They take him, they bind him, and they carry him before the high priest and also the chief judge over the land. And so Yeah, there you go. They're arresting somebody for teaching his belief.
Right. And there, at that point, they end up taking him before Alma, who apparently is the chief priest, the chief high priest, and the chief judge over all of the Nephites at this point.
Right. He speaks to this Gedona there in verse 23, and goes on reviling and blaspheming, and then Gedona is shocked at this, so that's when he sends him over to Alma. Yeah, one of the interesting things, not to kind of derail what we're talking about in terms of freedom of speech, but getting back to what the message of Korihor was, I've gone through here and kind of highlighted how many times Korihor criticizes the traditions of your fathers. And we talked about how that, Korihor's teaching was very similar to the messages that we hear today, and that's another one of those that we hear. There, especially in the last 10 years, there has been a really hard push to undermine the goodness and the credibility of the founding of America, of the founding fathers, of the principles that made this country a great country.
Yeah.
I think it was Tocqueville that came in the 19th century and did this study and wrote this book about the greatness of America. I can't remember the name of the book. But what he said, and one of the ways that he summed it up, was the greatness of America is not in its Constitution. It's not in its large amount of natural resources. It's not in its political system. It's in the righteousness of its people.
Right. And I think he was really struck by how religious Americans were in that day. And I think something that's pertinent to our conversation is not only how religiously observant those early Americans were, but sometimes I think we forget that those early colonies, the 13 colonies, were mainly founded as religious, kind of a blend of the religious and political structures. So you look at Maryland, it was Catholic. You look at, a lot of the New England states were begun as Protestant states. And some of them had religious tests in the beginning. So religion was really part of the founding fabric of our nation. And it seems like that's parallel to what the Nephites have here. They were founded by King Mosiah, who was very religious, but he turns it from this kind of theocratic monarchy into this system of judges and introduces some form of democracy. So I think there's some parallels here, and then they have to grapple with, what do we do with people who believe differently? Like you pointed out there in verse 7, it says there's no law against a man's belief. If that's the law, then why do they keep arresting him?
Yeah, so you said a lot there that I could piggyback off of. But yes, the founding of America was very religiously motivated. We know that the first pilgrims that came over were trying to escape religious persecution. That's why they came. And they were trying to be able to establish their religion in peace. And this is kind of a deeper dive, but that's the name of the podcast, right?
It fits.
Deep dive. So if anybody's interested in doing a deeper dive, there's a lot of political commentary out there about the founding of nations and why so much of Latin America is poor as opposed to North America. And this is one of the reasons, because the founders of the North American colonies came for freedom. They came to escape persecution. The founders of many of the Latin American countries came for wealth. They came specifically to plunder and to steal and to take stuff. Our founders came for freedom and specifically religious freedom. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's a big reason why there's such a disparity in prosperity, because of the way those two different systems were founded.
Right. I think there's something to be said for those founding principles and those founding values and how they inform a society and the development of a society.
Right. And rolling it back into the Nephites, they're here in the 17th year of the reign of the judges. Their founding father, their George Washington, King Mosiah, is the one that established this system. And by the way, paralleling and mirroring George Washington, I think the system was set up because Mosiah's sons did not want to be king. He tried to appoint them, and he asked the people, "Who do you want to be king?" They said, "Hey, give us Aaron." And Aaron's like, "No, I'm teaching the gospel." He's off on his mission to the Lamanites. So he wasn't available, and none of the sons wanted to. And that is a powerful mirror and a parallel, I think, to George Washington, who,
Could have
if
become
he
king.
could have become king, but he refused. And King George III said if he refuses being king, he'll be the greatest man that ever lived. So that's what it takes to get a founding nation like that. And so the Nephites had something very similar, but they're very young at this time in this thing with democracy, like we talked about. And so I think we're watching them here in chapter 30 in Alma kind of grapple with, well, what does the freedom of speech mean? We don't want this guy teaching Antichrist stuff. We want people to be able to believe what they want to believe, but grappling with those two things is a constant tension in political discourse.
Right. And then you get to Moroni's commentary on this. And this is something I think is really important as we're reading the Book of Mormon, is note where where Mormon, as he's abridging this, inserts his commentary. He makes little editorial commentaries throughout, which to me is also helps to verify the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, that this really is an abridgment where he went through and he'd make editorial comments on these stories. But he says in verse 20 that those in Jershon who had stopped Korihor were more wise than many of the Nephites. What do we make of that? Because that seems to work against this principle of there's no law against your belief. But now he's saying that in Jershon, where they stopped Korihor and apparently arrested him, they were more wise.
I'm not sure what to make of it, other than the only thing that I can surmise is if we're going to err on one side or the other between political freedom or adhering to the gospel, maybe we should err on adhering to the gospel. But at the same time, a core concept of the gospel is freedom. So it really is a difficult thing, I think, to grapple with. But I think the Lamanites didn't have this founding experience like the Nephites had. They didn't have a George Washington. They came over from a strict monarchy. And from what we understand about the Lamanite system of government, we have the story of when Ammon came over, and there's no trials and
It's just
not a lot of due
vassal kings
process,
and whatever
right?
their whims are.
Not a lot of due process among the Lamanites. So I think they're thinking to themselves, here's something I don't like, arrest him,
Right.
string him up maybe. And so I think that's probably why the Lamanites were a lot more willing to arrest him than the Nephites seemed to be. But why Mormon describes them as more wise, I can only guess that he had in mind they were being more strict and circumspect in observing and keeping the commandments of God. And there's also an immigration parallel in here, right? Because we have this accusation of xenophobia that is often thrown around because people want to control immigration. That seems to be what the motivation is here for the Nephites. For the Nephites and the Lamanites. The Lamanites, remember, were isolated in the land of Jershon.
Right.
And here's this guy coming in, interfering with their culture and their religion. We don't want this guy in here. We want to keep our society more pure, right?
Right.
So get him out of here. So there's that kind of aspect in the background of this too. How do you deal with that? But we're just so much more used to a pluralistic society because of our history and our culture and everything that we've seen. And we've had the experience of the Inquisition that happened in the Middle Ages and the terrible nature of what happened there when the Catholic Church was intermingled with the secular authorities, and you get people preaching heresies.
Right.
And they're burned at the stake. And the founders saw that experience, and we've seen that experience, and we just have a much greater tendency in our culture and our political discourse to separate religion from the secular authorities. And the Nephite society was clearly much more integrated in terms of the secular and the religious authorities. And in fact, in this instance, Alma, the chief judge, was also the high priest over the religion. So he held both of those titles. So it's much more of a theocracy among the Nephites,
Right.
which makes it a much more sticky question as to when the civil authority and the religious authority are so intertwined like that, do you really have complete freedom of speech if you're teaching false doctrine?
Right. Now, Alma seems kind of reticent to impose any sort of penalty on Korihor. He certainly debates him.
Yeah, he debates him, and I think it's another great reason why we have this story in front of us is because Alma gives us a really good model for how to counter Korihor's message. And what we'll hear atheists say towards believers a lot is, what proof do you have that there's a God?
Right.
You can't. You're just telling me there's a God. What proof do you have? And Alma turns that around on him and says, "What proof do you have there is no God?
Right.
Just your word only. We have the scriptures laid in front of us. We have all these witnesses. The scriptures are laid before you. Have you read them? Look at all the prophets going all the way back that have taught that there is a God. Look at this planet, everything that's around you, all of the order and the majesty of life and of trees. I have all things as a testimony that there is a God. What do you have?"
And this brings up an interesting point, and I think this is where Korihor gets himself into trouble. Because in verse 45 there, like you were saying, Alma asks him, "And yet you do go about leading away the hearts of this people, testifying unto them there is no God. And yet will ye deny against all these witnesses?" So he's just given him all of these witnesses to look at and says, where are your witnesses other than your word? Because we actually have quite a few witnesses that there is a God and that there is a creation and that there will be a Messiah. And so Korihor, I think...
Can I just say a word about witnesses?
Yes.
So I'm a lawyer, so I love witnesses, right? This is the way that our judicial system
And this is
set
getting
up.
to Old Testament stuff too
Right.
here.
This is how we establish facts. This is how we establish the truth,
Right.
is through witnesses. We swear people in, we bring them in front of the court, and they're under oath. And that's really the Lord's system as well. That's
is.
why we have the witnesses in the Book of Mormon.
Right.
And that's why the testimony of the three witnesses, testimony of the 8 witnesses. So this system of witnesses, I think, is really powerful. And when you compare the witnesses on one side or the other when it comes to whether or not there is a God, I think we have a substantial
We're on pretty
advantage
solid
there.
ground.
We have to the tune of hundreds of millions, billions of people that believe there is some sort of a divine being because they've had an experience with him.
Yeah. And it seems that Korihor also had a spiritual experience, right? A negative one.
Well, are you talking about in front of Alma or before he did his preaching?
Not quite yet. Before he did his preaching, he did. Right?
Sort of a spiritual.
Sort of like a negative spiritual experience.
Sure. So yeah, he ends up admitting, right, that Satan appeared to me as an angel,
Right.
and taught me what to say.
Right. So we know where these ideas come from. But at the end of his teaching, when he's before Alma here, and Alma's asking him for his witnesses, he says, "Show me a sign or I won't believe." He asks for a sign. And here I think he gets not only his word as a witness, but now he's going to get a second witness.
I think this is the ultimate foot and mouth moment that anybody's ever experienced, right?
Yeah, so this is where it says in verse 49, Alma said unto him, "This will I give unto thee for a sign, that thou shalt be struck dumb, according to my words. And I say that in the name of God ye shall be struck dumb, that ye shall no more have utterance." So it was this idea of talionic justice that I think the Old Testament helps to set up as an idea that there has to be some restriction on punishment, that the punishment has to fit the crime. And so it's interesting to see that crop up in the Book of Mormon here, where there might not have been a lot that the Nephites could have done. You know, if they really did have this law saying that you can believe whatever you want, we have no law against your belief. What are they supposed to do when you have an Antichrist come amongst you? And so we see this Old Testament style talionic justice come into play here, where he's preaching Antichrist. He's preaching against Christ. And so the justice he gets isn't being confined to prison. He's not fined anything as far as we know. He's struck dumb. He can't speak anymore.
That's a pretty harsh punishment, though, isn't it?
It is.
Especially in light of the freedom of speech.
Right.
I think there's a lot of people that would like to strike other people dumb.
Right. And I think we see that's so rife in our society today and I think there's a growing movement to just want to silence the opposition. So how do we grapple with that?
That's what God did here. So
But we're not God. So.
Right. We're not God. We're not God. But yeah, that's a tough one to grapple with. Well, one of the ways that I think about it, though, is, again, when you're in a theocracy and you have a society that you're trying to create, you're trying to build Zion, there's some sort of an obligation that you have to choose who comes into and out of that society. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about it like a compound right now, like we're free in this country enough to where if you want to do socialism or communism, you can go do it.
Right.
Go get 100 people or 1,000 people. You guys go buy yourselves 500 acres somewhere, mm-hmm. and you live on your private property, and you can do communism all day long. Mm-hmm. And so if you do that, then they're on private property, and they have a right to exclude people from their own private property and say, no, if you don't believe what we believe or
right.
teach what we teach,
you can't come here.
Freedom of
association.
Right, freedom of association. And so that's sort of what's happening here with the Nephites is we have a right to control our culture, to control our religion, to control our society, especially when it's more theocratic. Mm-hmm. So we're going to control who gets to say what a little bit more. Mm-hmm. But in our culture, of course, we're not theocratic. We have a strictly civil government, strictly secular government. So it's tougher. It's different. We have to afford people in our context, in our time, more freedom to say what they want to say. Right. And that's why it's enshrined in the First Amendment. But it goes both ways.
So how do we deal with that if, say the atheist professor, that example that you gave earlier, how do we deal with that with those who would teach Antichrist doctrines in a pluralistic society?
Yeah, I think the Supreme Court has made it out pretty clear in most of their free speech jurisprudence. You counter it with more free speech. Mm-hmm. You have to let people say what they want to say, and you have to counter it with your own truth. And, well, there's not relative truth. You have to counter it with the truth.
Right.
And get on podcasts and speak your mind.
And I think Alma actually is a great example of this, right? Because what does he do after this whole episode with Korihor? And he certainly had some personal, setting aside that question for a minute. If you go back to Alma chapter 8, I think it's really interesting when he goes to Ammonihah on this mission. Because the people in Ammonihah don't like what Alma's preaching. And so there in verse 13, it says, now when the people had said this and withstood all his words and reviled him and spit upon him and caused that he should be cast out of their city, he departed thence. So they actually cast Alma out. So he had some personal experience with this. And what does the Lord tell him to do in response? It's go back and preach again. Here in 16 and 17, it says he commands him to return to the city of Ammonihah and preach again, saying to them, except you repent, the Lord God will destroy them. For behold, they do study at this time that they may destroy the liberty of thy people, which is contrary to the statutes and judgments and commandments. So I think it's interesting that the people of Ammonihah that Alma's encountering here certainly don't believe in freedom of belief, right? They disagree with Alma. Their goal is actually, it says they're studying to destroy the liberty of the people. So I wonder if this creates kind of a backdrop or a context for how Alma deals with his encounter with Nehor later.
A law of Moses, eye for an eye. I got thrown out, so I'm gonna throw you out, Korihor.
Although he doesn't, he just strikes him dumb.
Strikes him dumb. Yeah, I wonder if there's a federalism aspect going on here, because each city seems to have its own authority and sort of make an independent decision.
Right.
Jershon throws out Korihor, and then the city of Gideon throws him out, and then Ammonihah threw out Alma. So there's apparently at least some sort of local level of control, of civil authority and civil control within each city,
Right.
rather than more of a nationwide thing like we have.
And I think it's interesting too, because when Alma does go back in to Ammonihah, there in verse 20, he encounters Amulek, and Amulek identifies himself as, I am a Nephite, which is a little odd to me, because shouldn't that be a given if he's living in Ammonihah?
I don't know. Were they dissenters in Ammonihah? Did they call themselves by a different
They were
name?
certainly on the way to being dissenters.
Yeah.
But it seems there that the issue might be not so much that a Nephite is a descendant of Nephi, but one who subscribes to the beliefs of the church.
Maybe. Yeah. And Amulek was a man of large or of good reputation. Like he was a VIP
Right.
in Ammonihah. He had
Right.
many kindred, and he was wealthy, and the people knew him, and apparently he was well respected. So yeah, I never thought about why he identifies himself as a Nephite there, but maybe I think certainly throughout the war chapters, Nephite Lamanite is more often used as an analog for righteous and wicked.
Right, right. Not
Even though there's clearly, it's all individual, but when you're abridging a big record, there's that abridgment again. I think sometimes you just have to use those analogs. But apparently, if Ammonihah, Amulek is using this to describe himself, yeah, he might be. But we also know that he's not a part of the church, is he?
well, it sounds like he's been away from it for a time,
Yeah.
but still believes.
So he received a commandment, a revelation that he would come across a prophet, and then he was commanded to feed him, and that's who Alma was shown to him in advance, right? So
And so then
Yeah.
together, they're both commanded to continue preaching to the people in Ammonihah who are not receptive. I think it's interesting that the Lord points out to them that part of the reason that he wants them preaching in Ammonihah is because the people in Ammonihah are aiming to destroy liberty. That's their goal.
right, which raises another question too about, is it acceptable to destroy somebody else's liberty because they're trying to destroy your
Yours.
liberty? And,
Right.
and I think so. I don't know how libertarian you are, but there's this principle of the non-aggression principle, which says the government is justified only in those instances. The government is justified in using its power only in those instances where somebody else is trying to use force against you. So if you're trying to overthrow my liberty, then I'm justified in restraining you and,
Right.
and taking away your liberty first because you're the aggressor. And that's the non-aggression principle. We see this in the war chapters with Moroni, who is taking a lot of harsh moves towards dissenters
Right.
and towards the kingmen.
Right. He's raising his title of liberty and saying, if you don't sign on to this, you'll be executed.
You're going to be executed. And that can be tough to grapple with, I think. But part of the point I was trying to raise earlier was, if you're going to have a society, there has to be some basic level of agreement on principles between the people that are going to be part of that society. That's part of what caused our nation to be successful, and I think it's the same for any nation. There has to be a basic level of agreement as to some basic principles.
Right.
If we can't, then I don't know how we can live in harmony with each other.
One of those being that both sides have the right to express their opinions.
Right.
So what happens when we get to, it seems like a growing sentiment today that the other side should not be allowed to speak. I mean, I think we see this in moves for hate speech laws and moves for combating what's called misinformation, labeling things misinformation or not.
Well, that's the way that they're trying to get it in, right? Is Satan is very subtle. of course, who's not against misinformation, right?
Right.
I think our constitutional system, especially on freedom of speech, has generally been very resilient. And I wonder sometimes if Satan is frustrated by that. But this seems to be the latest push for how you get it in there. You label something as misinformation, and now we're going to be the arbiters of truth. And we saw this. This was a very strong push under the Biden administration to do this. I can't remember the name of the particular executive, but he was in these White House meetings with the Biden administration where they had plans very deliberately to control corporations, to control social media, so that they could have their thumb on the scale of what is and what is not allowable to say.
Right.
That was a thing. And that's when that person that I'm describing, whose name I can't remember, came out of that meeting and decided, I'm voting for Trump. So I think we avoided a lot of trouble with getting Trump back in terms of freedom of speech. His administration has not been perfect by any means in that sense.
Yeah, I think we recently saw the Attorney General say we need hate speech laws in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination.
Yeah, we don't need hate speech laws. You should be punished for your crimes and not for the things that you say. Which reminds me, by the way, going back to Alma 30, it says that explicitly. So in verse 9, now if a man desired to serve God, it was his privilege, or rather, if he believed in God, it was his privilege to serve him. But if he did not believe in him, there was no law to punish him. In verse 10, but if he murdered, he was punished unto death. And if he robbed, he was also punished. And if he stole, he was also punished. And if he committed adultery, he was also punished. Yea, for all this wickedness they were punished. For there was a law that men should be judged according to their crimes. Nevertheless, there was no law against a man's belief. Therefore, a man was punished only for the crimes which he had done. Therefore, all men were on equal grounds. There's a strong parallel here between those verses and Section 134 in the Doctrine and Covenants, where we lay out our beliefs about civil government. And one of the points that's emphasized in 134, or Section 134, is this idea that government should restrain crime, should punish guilt, but never suppress the freedom of the soul. To me, I read a very close parallel between the doctrine we see in Alma 30 and the Doctrine and Covenants 134, between that doctrine and the non-aggression principle, which is government is only justified in acting
When there
is a crime, when you are doing something to take away other people's liberty, when you're trying to exercise force on somebody else. And that is interesting that it's said here that brings men onto equal grounds. So again, equality is something that we think is more of a modern political invention, but apparently the Nephites were trying to practice this idea of equality before the law.
And I think it's really interesting there because he quotes in verse 8, for thus saith the scripture, choose ye this day whom ye will serve. So there he's actually quoting Joshua as the Israelites are coming into the promised land and establishing their kingdom and figuring out what their form of government is going to look like. And he tells them, you can choose. And then we see in Samuel, they actually wanted to set up a system of judges similar to what the Nephites have here with Alma. But instead, they wanted a theocratic monarchy.
Is that the part where the Israelites say, give us a king that we can be judged by other nations?
That's in Samuel. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think we see there this idea that you can choose who you're going to serve. Now, the choice doesn't come without consequence. But even in the Old Testament, there is this sense that the choice is yours. This is an individual choice, who you're going to serve and what you're going to believe. And it's interesting, though, that when it comes to setting up their government, they reject a system of judges in favor of the kings.
They'd rather have a king.
Yeah.
They want to be like the other countries.
Right.
Yeah. I've seen a parallel to that, I think. In the way we are as members of the church, I don't think we like liberty enough. I think we're too comfortable with government, particularly with big government. And it seems to be, sometimes I feel like members of the church have a complex about not wanting to be weirdos, because we were considered weirdos for a very long time, and it really wasn't until President Hinckley came along and put us in the limelight, so to speak, with his media appearances, that people started to look at us as a little more normal and acceptable.
Maybe.
Like we're not a bunch of kooks. Yeah, maybe in some circles.
Right.
But we're definitely more mainstream now than we were than we've ever been in the past. But I think there's a tendency in a lot of us to sort of have this complex where no, we're not weirdos. We're just like you. And my feeling is, I don't know that I want to be just like the world or everybody else. We're supposed to be a peculiar people.
Right.
We're supposed to be a little bit weird. If we're doing things right, then I would think that the wicked would look at us as weird.
Right.
So I kind of fear sometimes when I'm not being criticized or judged harshly because maybe I'm not doing things
If the
right.
world loves you, you might not be on the right side.
Right.
But
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just to tie off that point that you were talking about, where the Israelites said, "Hey, we want a king because we want to be like all the other countries," and I kind of see that attitude crop up. I think in the church, where hey, we're okay with government. We want to do, zoning laws and regulations and all the bureaus and public schools and everything else, just like everybody else does, because we're not weird. We'll do it that
Right,
way
we'll
too.
go along with it.
Instead of choosing to be governed by God's laws. And I'm not suggesting that there's a direct contradiction between those things and God's laws.
Right.
But I think when you're governed more by the spiritual principles of the gospel, you have much less of a need for secular government. You have much less of a need for all of these bureaus and all of the regulatory apparatus that we see in government.
Which is interesting, because I think if you look at our early church history, especially going back to Missouri, I mean, here you have a group of people trying to set up what in many respects was a theocratic community, right? But then they have the power of the state come down on them. You have the extermination order in Missouri, to the point that eventually the Saints move out west and set up in Utah so that they could freely practice their religion.
Which made a lot of government people nervous, right?
Right.
Because we were setting up our own theocracy, kind of like the Nephites were doing, and it was very mixed. And for a long time, we resisted joining
the union,
and resisted having the same kinds of laws in state government that the other states had.
Right.
But that eventually.
So we come out of that
eroded away.
history of being a little bit suspicious of government power to now maybe embracing it too much.
I think.
In the opinion of Dustin Romney.
Yeah.
I do find it interesting, though, that here in facing Korihor, as Alma's before Korihor and Mormons relating this story to us, that he makes that appeal to this Old Testament principle of choose ye this day whom you will serve. And that this has to be a matter of individual choice. Whether the Nephites implemented it appropriately, because of course there's that impulse to just want to silence, but that is the Old Testament principle, that there has to be freedom of personal conscience. And that is something that is in our doctrine in section 134, and in the Articles of Faith, that you cannot force a man to believe in God, right? There has to be personal freedom in matters of belief.
Well, to a certain extent, apparently, right? Because like I was, tying back to the point I was making earlier, there has to be some sort of basic level of agreement on first principles, like freedom of conscience, like freedom of religion. The communists in the Soviet Union and in China couldn't have that. You can't have freedom. You can't believe in God because that replaces the state. That's the opposite of what I just said about the more reliant you are on gospel principles, the less in need you are going to be of government. But if the government is going to control things, then they have to replace God. And that's why the Soviets and the Chinese went to such unbelievable efforts to try to get rid of God completely.
Right.
So we're seeing this in our culture and our society today. I'm not suggesting we come up with hate speech or speech codes or arrest people who want to be communist.
I mean, we
But
could
if
go
you're-
back to the McCarthy era, right?
Sure, but if you're advocating basically to overthrow our system of government, which I think to a great extent progressives have been successful in doing, by the way. We have a very different constitution today than we had before 1937. It's not the same. It's not the same constitution. It's very different. It was radically altered under the New Deal. That's why they called it the New Deal.
Right.
It was a new deal. It was a new constitution. that they gave
reinterpretation of
us,
all
a
of that.
total reinterpretation, which goes back into my book and why I think we need amendments to restore what we had there before.
So where do we draw the lines then?
That's a tough. I don't know. I mean, because we have to have freedom. We have to allow people the ability to reserve their freedom. Look, I've gone through quite an odyssey, I think, since I wrote my book, which was 10 years ago, by the way. And I was really stuck in writing my book on the Constitution that we have is going to save us. But the founders and framers of the Constitution said themselves, these are parchment barriers. This is not what's going to save us. The Constitution that we have, the system of government we have, is only adequate to a righteous and moral people.
Right.
And that's why I've actually come to appreciate Charlie Kirk so much more than I have in the past since then, because it's ultimately not the Constitution that we have that's going to save our society. It's people repenting.
Yeah.
It's people going back to church. It's mothers and fathers choosing to be better mothers and fathers,
Right.
choosing to be better spouses, choosing
It's
to raise
the
better
choose ye
kids.
this day.
Choose ye this day. That's ultimately what is going to save society. And that's where the ultimate work that the church does in changing hearts and minds. You know, little bit of a sidebar, but people complain a lot about the church is not doing enough with their vast amounts of wealth. But what Elder Bednar said was so true, is look, what we do is change hearts and minds. The world would have us change people's circumstances. Well, I can't remember if it was Kimball or Benson, right? The world wants to take the slum, take people out of the slums.
Yeah.
Christ takes the slums out of people, and then they
Right.
take themselves out of the slums.
And I think that's where de Tocqueville's observation is so astute, that it wasn't necessarily that we had this new land or that we had so many resources. Even though I believe that the structure of our government was divinely inspired, it wasn't necessarily even that. It was that the people were good, and they were good because they believed in God. And that's what made the American founding so unique.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. The Constitution is divinely inspired. It's very important, but it can only buy us time.
Right.
If the people are going to be wicked and they're going to choose wickedness, then the Constitution's not going to save us.
So then how do we counter it when someone like Charlie Kirk, and whether you agree with his ideas or not, he's out there openly debating people and then is assassinated for it. What do we do when you said, in order to have this functioning society or this functioning freedom of speech, you have to have both sides of a debate acknowledging each other's right to speak. If one side does not acknowledge that right to speak, then what do we do?
You have to win hearts and minds. I don't know any other way around it. It's the war in heaven continued on earth. It's the constant struggle that we've been battling since time immemorial. Freedom versus tyranny. We know what Satan's plan is. He wants to buy up armies and navies and have false priests and tyrants who oppress and reign with blood and horror on this earth. And we have to counter that with the message of freedom. And not just freedom, but freedom coupled with responsibility and righteousness.
Right. Because freedom can't be licentiousness, right?
Right.
So, and I think that's where Alma, again, is really instructive when it comes to this. Because after he deals with Korihor, after Korihor is struck dumb, and it's interesting, too, that Korihor's final fate is in the hands of the Zoramites. It's not under Nephi. He actually ends up going to the Zoramites, who have denied the gospel, have denied God's law at this point. They're preaching really a self-serving, an interesting, different kind of theology. And it says, came to pass that as he went forth among the people, yea, among a people who had separated themselves from the Nephites and called themselves Zoramites, being led by a man whose name was Zoram. And as he went forth amongst them, behold, he was run upon and trodden down even until he was dead. So it's not really clear if this was like an accidental hit and run or if this was intentional among the Zoramites, but that's where he meets his final fate. And Mormon is careful here to point out, thus we see the end of him who perverteth the ways of the Lord. And thus we see that the devil will not support his children at the last day, but doth speedily drag them down to hell. And that's Korihor's ultimate fate, right? It wasn't being locked up in a prison. He wasn't fined. He kind of met this talionic justice or divine justice of, you're struck dumb, and then the person you've chosen, like this kind of gets to the choose ye this day principle, that he chose to follow Satan. That was his choice. And so that's the consequences he reaped.
Yeah, it's a tragedy, right? To see what happened to him. But we know wickedness never was happiness. And I think there is a lot more unhappiness among non-conservatives, people who are not practicing conservative values. Mm-hmm. We've seen studies that have showed that, actually.
But let me play devil's advocate here a little bit.
Please.
Because if we really believe in free speech, and that's a foundational principle, then why not let people speak freely? And you think, there's a lot of debate now over what types of books are allowed in classrooms, or, is it okay how far does self-expression go? Let's say you identify as the opposite gender and you want to participate in female sports. Is that part of freedom of expression? Is that part of freedom of speech? And how do we grapple with that?
Well, that specific issue I don't think is a speech issue. And I don't even know, by the way, that that's a political issue. It only becomes a political issue because government gets involved in things. Mm-hmm. Like the notion that government is running education, to me, is crazy just as a first principle. I know we've all grown up with it and we're all used to it. But the notion that we're going to have government decide what gets taught and what doesn't get taught is troubling, to say the least, for me.
Do you want to be a guest on the Stick of Joseph YouTube channel?
Just hit the link in our description or go to thestickofjoseph.com, and underneath contact us. We'd love to learn more about you and what you'd like to share.
So I think that's sort of a separate issue from speech, but what do you do? I just keep coming back to, you have to try to win hearts and minds. We have to take advantage of the freedoms that we have and speak up and speak out for the truth. The brethren and the leaders of the church have been very clear on that, where they've urged us to go out, to speak our minds, to teach, to testify, to post, to be a voice for good in this world. We have to do that. We have to win hearts and minds and let the chips fall away may. When I read the Book of Mormon, we talked about how things change so quickly, and Mormon has to abridge over all of this history so quickly. Like, in the 78th year, they were righteous, and in the 79th year, they were wicked. And it's like, what happened?
Right.
What happened in between 2 years ago? You were thriving and righteous, and now you're wicked. I don't know what happened, other than we know Satan and his minions are constantly at work trying to win over hearts and minds. Mm-hmm. We have to constantly be countering that. And it's just a constant struggle and a constant battle. And we know there's going to be ebbs and flows in that battle. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we're going to have to retreat, and sometimes they're going to have to retreat. And I think right now we're doing okay, holding our own. We've lost a lot of ground over the decades. But I think what we've seen in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination is a real reawakening in a lot of people. And ironically, his death, I think, has inspired a lot more good than Charlie Kirk ever could have done if he had continued living, going around campuses doing what he was doing. And a lot of people have responded to that. And I think it's actually been a defining event that has aided or contributed to the separation, the great separation that we're seeing between the wheat and the tares.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting principle too, when you bring up the wheat and the tares, because the Lord tells us that we have to let the wheat grow along with the tares, right? We don't go through and just get rid of the tares, but that these two things have to grow together. And so I think when it comes to how do we grapple with dealing with Antichrist philosophies in our society, with those with whom we may disagree, there has to be the acknowledgement that these two things must exist simultaneously until the Lord says he's done.
Yeah, going back to how we deal with societies, we have a separation of church and state. Wasn't strong in the Nephite society, but it's very strong in our society. Obviously, within the church, we can be very strict about who says what. And,
Right.
And if you're going to get up in the pulpit in our church meetings, you're not going to say certain things. We're not going to tolerate that.
Right.
But when it comes to civic discourse, the civil government has to decide, and we don't want to turn over the authority to the civil government to decide who gets to say what. That's never going to end well. If it's informed by good theocracy, good gospel doctrine, then maybe it's a little more acceptable, and especially if it's in a smaller community. But in a large pluralistic society like we have in the United States, we're not turning over to the civil government the idea of who gets to control, who gets to say what. So we just have to work within the system that we're in. And
So you're saying follow
hearts
the
and
example of Alma, who, after dealing with Korihor in chapter 31,
strike people dumb, strike our opponents dumb.
after he strikes them dumb, then he takes another tack, I think. So looking in chapter 31, though, here, for a period, Alma has been serving as the chief high priest and the chief judge. This seems to be one responsibility together that combines the state and the church. And now he kind of separates these out, right? He goes on a mission to reclaim the Zoramites and to maybe undo some of the damage that Korihor has done. And he just goes out preaching. Okay. So I think this is where we see Alma give up the judgment seat. So what had been this combined church and state, he now separates more fully, which I think is an interesting development in the Nephite society and their structure of government, where he now appoints someone to just be the chief judge. And Alma now just becomes the chief high priest and spends the rest of his days preaching and teaching and trying to undo, I think, some of the damage that Korihor has done.
It might be really easy to criticize that, to say, are you crazy? Why not keep reins of the government and exercise more control that way?
Absolutely.
Right? But I think he understood the principle we were talking about earlier. Ultimately, it's not the system of government that's going to save us. It's people's hearts and minds.
Yeah.
If you have a righteous enough people, you don't need any government.
Right. And our government, we've been told, was it Benjamin Franklin who said that? That our government is, maybe it was Adams. I think it was Adams, who said that our government is suited to a righteous people and none other.
When you're talking about having a theocracy, we generally don't like that. But the reality is we believe in theocracy. We refer to Christ as a king.
Right.
And he's going to come again and establish a theocracy. He's going to rule and reign. He's going to take over the reins of government everywhere, all over the world. There is a government within God's kingdom. It's called a kingdom. So it's not so much that we don't want theocracy. It's we want the right kind of theocracy. But obviously when we're living in a pluralistic society, people we don't agree with, we can't impose it on anybody.
Right.
That's not how the gospel is supposed
It has
to
to
work.
be voluntary.
It has to be through love and persuasion and patience. It has to be voluntary. And that's
Right.
That's where the freedom comes in. And that's why the first principle has to be freedom.
Right. And I think that's where our responsibility comes in as members of the church. That, we may face our critics and our opponents, whether it's on a theological basis, well, whether it's directed right at our particular brand of Christianity or whether it's theism as a whole, that it's incumbent on us to stand up and to defend and to win the hearts and minds and not to try to shut down our critics.
I like hearing, well, I don't know if I like hearing anti-Mormon stuff, but I relish the opportunity to teach. I relish the opportunity to correct, to testify. When I hear a criticism about we're not Christian, the Book of Mormon this or that, or Joseph made it up or whatever it is, I relish those opportunities to just say something simple in response and say, look, just as an example, Joseph Smith was an uneducated farm boy. Read the Book of Mormon. There's no way he made this up. With a library at his disposal, with a team of scholars at his disposal, he could not have done this in years, let alone produce this thing in 3 months.
Right.
So, yeah, I like those opportunities to do that. And so it's creating that discourse and that back and forth debate. I don't ever want to shut them down. I want to persuade them.
How do we manage that in a culture where, we face cancel culture? And I think this is something that a fair number of members of the church may struggle with, where you don't necessarily want to speak up. You don't want to testify. You don't want to be seen as, the oddball. And so we stay silent. How do we counter that?
It's part of the test of life, right? To see if they will do whatsoever things the Lord will command them. And it's really easy to sit back on our phones and put out stuff on social media, but when the rubber really meets the road, if you're going to lose your job for saying something, that's when the real test is going to come. And I've thought about that, and I hope I could pass that test if it ever comes, but I don't know. We'll have to see.
How do we grapple with that too when we're told to be peacemakers and to avoid contention? How do we then contend for the gospel and for the truth?
How many times do I start typing out a tweet or a Facebook post or something, and then the Spirit whispers and okay, delete. And then we redo it. That's, to me, that's the advantage of social media, is you get a chance to think about what you're going to say. Unfortunately, people don't
stop and think.
Take advantage of that. Like I kind of take pride in really thinking about what I'm saying before I post something, and I don't always get everything right, but yeah, we're called to do it in the Savior's way, not our own way. I spent some time fasting a couple weeks ago thinking about this and wanting to have more of a voice on social media as part of the calling that I think I want to have, trying to have more of an influence, a positive influence, but it has to be in His way, not my way. And yeah, it's a challenge because we're the natural man, and the natural man comes up a lot, but we've got to put that aside and do it in the Savior's way.
What do you think that dividing line is between being contentious and contending righteously?
Yeah, you listen to the fruits of the Spirit, right? Is this message enlightening? Is it enlarging? Can it enlarge somebody's soul? Is it going to make somebody feel embarrassed? Is it designed to make you feel better? Is it a one-upsmanship thing? Is it a gotcha type tweet or message? Or is it something that's genuinely intended to enlighten or to enlarge somebody's mind or to educate in a humble way?
Right. No, I think that's a really great distinction between the two, because I think some people do struggle to know. It's like, if I am standing up for what I believe in, am I then being contentious, or am I not being a peacemaker? I think sometimes we equate being a peacemaker with going along with what people are saying, or going along with things we may disagree with. And so that can be a struggle to navigate. How am I being a peacemaker while still contending for the truth?
Yeah, that's a hard one to grapple with. We're told to contend. And Moroni seemed contentious quite a bit.
Yeah, he was kind of contentious.
He was, you accept the title of liberty, we're going to cut your head off. So, yeah, it's a challenge. I think I don't necessarily agree that anger is always contentious or is always forbidden. Jesus got angry sometimes. Now, we're not Jesus, but he got angry sometimes. He had some harsh words for the Sanhedrin. He had some harsh words for the powers that be. I just feel like everybody has to follow the Spirit in every individual circumstance. There's a time to just be quiet and not say anything. And there's a time to stand up and say, you know what? I'm not going to let that one slide.
Right.
I got to say something.
Right.
And yeah, sometimes it's got to be a firm, blunt voice. But
Yeah.
it's just it's so circumstantial and dependent on the situation, and I think everybody's got to grapple with that the best they can. But I think you're going to error if you just create this blanket rule that you always have to be a sheep, or that you have this idea that, oh, it's just my personality. I'm speaking up for the truth, so I'm going to offend people. I don't care if people get offended. You got to find a middle ground there somewhere and just try to follow the Spirit as best you can in what to say in each situation.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I think that creates that's a good distinction between how to contend without being contentious and how to still be a peacemaker while standing for the truth. It's a fine line to navigate sometimes.
Yeah, it's one thing for me to sit here and talk about it. It's another thing to actually do it.
do
So
it,
I'm not
yeah.
suggesting that I'm a model to follow or anything. I've had my share of smart aleck comments. So just for the record.
And maybe that's kind of a test right there is, are we being a smart aleck? Are we being intentionally offensive? Are we name calling? Are we, devolving into ad hominem attacks, or are we actually defending true principles?
Yeah.
And maybe that's a test.
Yeah, I
For our
agree.
words.
Sometimes I like the shock value of saying things, and I don't know that that's necessarily contentious, but I'm hopeful that it maybe might.
I mean,
get somebody's
Christ called
attention.
the Sanhedrin a pit of vipers, did he not?
Right. Children of hell. And the Book of Mormon is really full of examples of this. Like we're reading in Helaman about Nephi again, and this guy is just tearing these people to pieces. You wicked, adulterous children of hell, you guys better repent or your cities are going to get destroyed.
Right.
And he offended people. I don't know, that sounds contentious.
Right.
But he was blessed, and one of them was a mighty prophet. So I grapple with this too, is the culture was certainly different in his time. It's much different in our time. And I don't know, it bothers me that culture should have such a great influence on how we speak and act. Like, I want to cut away from the culture and just tell me what's the right thing to do here, regardless of how the culture is going to judge it. But certainly in their time, in Old Testament times, things were just harsher. Life
could
was
call
just
things out a
harsher.
little bit.
Civilization was
Right.
harsher. It was the law of Moses. It was eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It seems like maybe we're more refined now. I don't know. Maybe we're more sensitive now. Well, we're certainly more sensitive. That's for sure. But I don't know if that's more refined or not. I think because on the one hand, you could say it's more refined because we're being sensitive to other people's feelings. But on the other hand, if people are that sensitive to the truth, then that's not refinement.
Because the wicked taketh the truth to be hard.
The wicked taketh the truth to be hard. That's not refinement. So, yeah, it's just something that everybody has to grapple with in their unique circumstance. But I think the key for me is, have you ever said anything controversial that has made somebody upset?
Oh, yeah.
If you haven't, I think that's probably an issue with you not speaking up when you're supposed to speak up.
Interesting.
And on the other hand, if you're always ticking people off and offending people, then maybe that's a problem, right?
Right,
And so
right.
Find some middle ground there.
Right. And it does seem like in our culture today, we are very afraid of offending. We don't want to be offensive.
And that's one of the ways they
Yeah.
try to silence you.
Right.
That's
So maybe
where-
that's even the greater danger than a state-imposed censorship is self-imposed censorship. or culturally imposed censorship.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we're living through right now. And I think that's why people on the left diagnose you more than they debate you.
What do you mean by that?
They,
Explain that.
They, instead of arguing with the principle that you're talking about, they're just going to call you a name and say, well, you're racist, so you can't say that. That's racist to say that. I was listening to Bill Maher the other day. I don't know if he's appropriate to even mention on this show, but he said something to the effect of, somebody was racist because, he was talking about immigration. And he was pointing out that I think it was in Sweden, they've had tens of thousands of refugees come in, and the crime level skyrocketed after that. And he's like, is it racist to point that out? I don't care. Is it true? That's what I'm worried about. You call me a racist, but why can't we talk about truth and facts without worrying about being called a racist?
Right. The facts don't care about your feelings, right?
Right. Do you know who Charles Murray is?
Yes.
So Charles
Yeah.
Murray, great author. He's had, this issue. He's pointed out facts, data, but somehow that's racist for him to just point out facts and data. The fact that Asian people are more successful than white people and white people are more successful than African American people. It's no commentary on why or that is. It's just pointing out those facts, and sometimes that's just offensive to people. But we have to be able to get to a point where we can talk about truth and facts without worrying about offending.
So when it comes to members of the church who are worried about how we're perceived in the world, who are worried about maybe fitting in with the broader Christian world, and we don't want to offend, how do we navigate that?
Yeah, I've grappled with this recently, and I think kind of had some enlightening moments, because President Nelson was so great at building bridges with other religions, and there's a part of me that kind of looks at that and thinks, why aren't we just teaching the truth? But we know when the Savior comes, there's going to be people of multiple different beliefs. Not everybody's going to be a member of the Church of Jesus Christ.
Right.
And I think there's a wisdom now, looking back on it, in building those bridges, because there's more of a dividing line. Not all the wheat are going to be members of the Church of Jesus Christ.
Right. That dividing line doesn't run through denominations.
Right. And I think there's a wisdom in us being aligned with other people who are like-minded conservatives that believe in family, that believe in Christ, that believe in goodness and wholesomeness in general. There's a wisdom in that, and I think him building those bridges is important. And I've had to learn to temper my attitudes and my feelings, to not just want to pound the pulpit all the time and teach the truth no matter what, and instead just focus on the things that we have in common, and just build bridges and be friends.
So it's because this is one thing I worry about when we talk about freedom of speech, and especially in the wake of Charlie Kirk and the attack on the LDS Church in Michigan, is you worry that sometimes it devolves into tribalism and into an us versus them mentality. Like, if you got to be part of this group or that group. So I think your point is well taken, that we need to reach across some of those denominational lines and find the truth that unites us. And it reminds me of Schultz-Nietzen's quote that the line between good and evil doesn't run between these different groups or nationalities or what have you. It runs through every human heart, and that it's really the hearts and minds that have to be one for the truth.
Yeah, it's objective, and it's not. I don't think we claim to have a monopoly on truth or theology. We believe that we're the true church that's led by Christ, but we don't have a monopoly on goodness by any means. I've seen so much goodness. I've been inspired by so many non-LDS Christians and their faith and their testimony, almost to a greater extent, because having grown up in the church, I've had a lot of tools and a lot of advantages to be able to develop that testimony and that love, but we tend to take it for granted in the church. But people outside the church that have had to kind of do it without all of those auxiliary meetings and mutuals and, general conferences.
The entire support system.
And
Yeah.
and all that support system of extended family and community. And for them to figure it out, it's almost like they tend to cherish Christ more than I do sometimes. And it's actually, frankly, not embarrassing, but
It's inspiring.
it's inspiring, and it makes me question whether or not I'm, as devoted as I need to be. So there's definitely a lot of good out there, and it's hard when you see the anti-people that are just determined to tear us up and call us not Christian. I just tend to ignore those folks, though.
Yeah.
I think there's enough people that recognize our goodness. The intellectual side of me, though, always wants to go to
Proving.
right. If you,
Right.
well, if you recognize our goodness, then you can't say that all the stuff that led to our founding was just made up. Because
If this is the fruit, then the tree must be good.
if it's good fruit, then look at the root. I always want to go there because that's. There are so many non-LDS people that have recognized even the goodness of the Book of Mormon and recognize that this is a brilliant piece of literature. Like, this is not something that somebody just made
You
up.
can't
This
just
is-
dismiss it.
Right. And so I'm like, okay, then why don't you believe it? Because the person that translated it gave us the story. Either he was lying or not. If he was lying, I don't know how you could get all that goodness from a fraud.
Right.
So anyway, we can set aside those intellectual debates from time to time and just focus on the fact that there are really great people.
Which
that
is,
are
I
doing
think,
great
where
things.
Alma is instructive again here, taking it back to where we started, where he took time to talk with Korihor, but also he put his life on the line to go preach to the people in Ammonihah. And doesn't sound like he was terribly successful there, but he did win Amulek. And they went on to have a huge impact on the rest of Nephite society and their teaching. And so he was willing to go into what may have been seen as enemy territory, but to build bridges there.
Yeah, he went to the Zoramites after Korihor, right?
Yeah, after Korihor. But before
Before he was
Korihor,
in, in Ammonihah, right?
Right.
You know what I've thought about the mission to the Zoramites? That this didn't register with me all the times I read the Book of Mormon before. All the war chapters are the result of Alma's mission to the Zoramites.
Yep.
Because he went there, ticked them off so badly.
They ran to the
They
Lamanites.
went to the Lamanites and said, let's go kill those people. And the entire war chapters that we read about are because Alma went on a mission to the Zoramites.
And he actually says that. Let me see if I can find it.
So speaking of, the consequences of speaking up, sorry to cut you off,
No, go ahead.
but just that thought, like, if we're worried about the consequences of saying something offensive, just remember that Alma started a war because he went and served a mission,
Because
he started a war that killed
Right.
tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, so in 31 verse 4, he says that the Nephites greatly feared that the Zoramites would enter into a correspondence with the Lamanites and that it would be the means of the Nephites, or be the means of great loss on the part of the Nephites. So this was his fear. And I think his mission to the Zoramites was to try to forestall that. And really, like, why did all those war chapters aren't there so that we can strategize our best war tactics. They're there to show us where these Antichrist thoughts lead, where those philosophies lead, and it leads to a dividing of society into war. And that was the outcome, right? And I think Alma was trying to forestall some of that.
Yeah, as a prophet, apparently he saw that early on, and he saw that this was a dangerous situation. We had these dissenters
Right.
over there, and they're getting ready to team up with.
And he was willing to relinquish his political power to go.
Right. And so he saw it in advance, and unfortunately his mission wasn't successful enough to stop it. But I wonder what the parallel to that is. I think we always have to ask that question when we're reading the Book of Mormon, because we know it's written for our day. But we have dissenters And they're not necessarily dissenters in the sense that they go to another country, although there are a lot of people that are expatting. But they're dissenters in the sense that they are abandoning the traditions of their fathers. They're abandoning the religious teachings of their fathers and of their ancestors. And they're dissenters among us, and they're allying with other forces that are trying to change all of that. They're rewriting the Constitution. They're rewriting our laws. They're rewriting the way they think society ought to be ordered. So I think that's one of the parallels that we can draw there. But
So regardless of how successful Alma may or may not have been, I think the lesson for us is that we need to seek out those allies where we can. Like Alma, went to Ammonihah, found Amulek, went among the other cities, no doubt had some measure of success there, and sought out those allies. And he really strove to preserve the truth and to debate the Antichrist philosophies and stand for what was true. And it may not have been as successful as he would have hoped, but I think when we stand on the side of truth in the end, it says, the devil won't support his children, but in the end, God will, and defending that truth is worth it, even if it comes at the risk of our reputation, perhaps.
yeah, the devil won't support his children. That reminded me of a point that I was going to earlier, and I think I might have strayed off on it. But we see, I think, so much more unhappiness among people who are not following traditional conservative values. I think we see it particularly among women who are forbidding to marry, forbidding to have children, pursuing a career, and they're not happy.
Yeah. I think we see it among men as well, where we
Absolutely.
have these young men who are just adrift, and there's this nihilism creeping into our society where, you can go to all the parties you want, you can engage in all of these sorts of practices, but it's all meaningless in the end.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's on both sides of the political spectrum in some sense. Matt Walsh, is that, Matt Walsh is? So he was bringing this point up earlier about people on the right, so to speak, who are traditionally conservative, that are like teaching men. You have this Andrew Tate figure,
Right.
teaching men to basically abandon and give up marriage and just pursue a life of pleasure and wealth and give up on it. But it's happening on both sides is
Right.
what I think is interesting. So yeah, but there's no question, I think, from a social science standpoint, that people who marry and have kids are generally happier than people who do
Right.
not. So it comes back to the concept that God repeated numerous times in the Book of Mormon. It's probably the most oft-repeated phrase in the Book of Mormon. If you keep my commandments, you'll prosper in the land.
Right.
Well, what are the commandments? Get married. Take individual responsibility. Get educated. Get a job. Work hard.
Right.
And the social science, the economic science, is abundantly clear that it is really, really easy to avoid poverty if you do a few basic things.
Right.
Graduate high school, get a job, get married, stay married, have kids. You do those things, you're almost guaranteed to stay out of poverty if you do those things.
And not only is it personally fulfilling and is it better for the rising generation, but that's also what creates stability in a society.
Absolutely.
That's ultimately the main bulwark of a free society,
Right.
is happy,
And-
functioning families.
That was one of the main messages that Charlie Kirk brought to campuses, right? Encouraging these young men to embrace marriage, to embrace child rearing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we have to find the courage of our convictions, right? And have you seen the movie Truth and Treason?
I'm not.
This is not a paid promo, I promise. But it tells the story of Helmuth Huebner during the rise of Nazi Germany.
Okay.
And he's a 17-year-old member of the church living in Hamburg, Germany, and has the courage to, when everyone else is silent and going along with this rising tyranny, to, he finds a shortwave radio and listens to BBC broadcasts and starts putting together newsletters countering Hitler and distributing them until he was arrested and executed. And when I saw the movie, I thought, his story is really inspiring, but it kind of feels like he wasn't successful because in the end he was executed. And in some respects, I guess that, you're talking about how Alma and his work ultimately leads to this huge Nephite war. And you could say maybe that wasn't successful, but I wonder if the success comes in the courage to defend truth. It's not necessarily that, Hubner didn't defeat Hitler. He stood up against him. Alma couldn't stop the coming war, but he tried. And so I wonder if we need to reframe success into, do we have the courage of our convictions? Are we willing to speak up and defend the truth?
There's been so many times when I've said, what's the point? I don't need to say anything. Mm-hmm. And I've even gone into I gave up on politics for like a 2-year stretch. I don't even care anymore.
Politics gets ugly.
But that's part of Satan's tactic, I think, to silence us. Mm-hmm. We don't. What I've had to learn is we don't speak up for the sake of just for the sake of the people that we're talking to. Mm-hmm. We speak up for our own sakes because we have a responsibility to do it. It behooveth everybody that have been warned to warn his neighbor. It's for our sakes that we do it.
Right.
So, Abinadi went into the pit of the fire. He got one person. But even if he had been successful in not getting Alma, he had to do it for his own sake, right? Because that's what we're commanded to do. Mm-hmm. We have to go out, we have to teach, we have to testify. And if we're unsuccessful in the sense that people don't listen to us, we can at least face the Savior and say, I did what I thought I needed to do. I tried my best. Well,
I think that's a great place to end here. It's been a great conversation, and I think that's a great take-home message for all of us, is be willing to stand up and defend the truth.
Awesome. Andrea, it's been great.
Yeah. Thanks for joining me today.